You received a MacArthur grant pretty recently, right? When was that?
It started in. I got it. They announced it in September, but I received it. It's 5 years, and started from January.
And so have you thought about what you're going to do with that?
Yeah, I'll make films with the focus and depth and wildness that sustains me and drives me without having to worry about anything else. So it's really, really nice.
So you don't have a specific project that you have
I
lined
do,
up?
but I can't talk about it.
Of course, of course. So let's talk about The Look of Silence. I've seen The Act of Killing. It's been a little while, so we might have to brush up a little on it. Another film that I loved. So when did you first meet Adi, and how did you decide that that was going to be the thread into which you were going to enter this story?
Well, I first met Adi in 2003, after when I began working with the survivors. You see, I was on a plantation region in North Sumatra where Adi's brother, Ramli, who was murdered, was virtually synonymous with the killings across the region. And the reason for that was that all the other tens of thousands of people killed in that area had more or less been taken out in the dead of night from political prisons, killed, thrown in rivers, allowed to drift to sea, and never heard from again. But Ramli's murder had witnesses. So to speak about Ramli was in some ways, a way of insisting that these events, which had traumatized everybody, yet the government had threatened everybody into pretending had not occurred, it's a way of insisting these events had really happened. So it was almost an act of defiance against the silence, almost an act of resistance, kind of like pinching yourself to remind yourself you're awake. And so everybody would speak about Ramli as though he was synonymous with the whole genocide. And so it was inevitable that I would be introduced to Ramli's family, and I fell in love with Ramli's mother and his father, who back then was not yet suffering from dementia. And then they quickly introduced me to Adi because they'd conceived of Adi was born after the killings. They'd conceived of him as a kind of replacement for their murdered son. And Adi was different from the rest of the family because somehow Adi, being born later, wasn't traumatized in the same way. And to protect him from the stigma of being labeled, designated, or known to be the relative of a victim, the family had told him very little about what had happened. So Adi is desperate for answers when I met him. What had happened to his family? What had happened to his community? What had happened to his country? And he saw in my project with the survivors the way of finding answers to these questions. So he kind of latched himself onto my work and quickly became the center of it, finding groups of survivors, often relatives and fellow neighbors from this village, to tell me what they had experienced in it's all part of the early research for what became these two films. And the whole idea was we would make a film about why the survivors are still so afraid. What is it like for them to have to live surrounded by the still powerful men who killed their relatives, and consequently with the fear that the killings could happen again at any time? What is it like to live under that kind of threat, and therefore in silence for so long that you're unable to grieve, unable to work through, unable to mourn, unable to heal? That really thematically is what The Look of Silence became. This was back in 2003, and the army found out what we were doing and threatened all of the survivors, including Adi, not to participate in the film. Now, Adi and everyone said, don't give up. Please, don't go home. Try to film the perpetrators. You see, I think the survivors knew the perpetrators were boastful. So they'd heard them boasting as a kind of way of asserting their impunity and power over their neighbors who were either bystanders or survivors. And they suspected they would maybe boast for my cameras. Well, I didn't know this. I was afraid to approach the perpetrators at first, but when I did, I found that all of them were immediately open, that it took nothing to get them to open up. And I filmed my first encounter with a perpetrator. He's boastfully telling the details of killings in front of his granddaughter. I show this to those survivors who wanted to see it, and Adi certainly was among them, and to the broader Indonesian human rights community. Everybody said, keep filming the perpetrators. And Adi said something very insightful. He said, keep filming the perpetrators because anybody who sees this will see that there's still something terribly wrong today. It's important that I emphasize that because I think often people say these are films about the 1965 killings. They are not. They're films about the present, about the terrible legacy of impunity. And so I agreed to film, so feeling entrusted by the survivors, feeling entrusted by Adi to do a work that they couldn't do themselves, and in constant dialogue and collaboration with them, I filmed every perpetrator I could find across the region for 2 years. Working my way up the chain of command. Anwar Congo I met about 2 years in. He was the 41st perpetrator I would film. I lingered on him because his pain was right there at the surface, and I suddenly realized that the boasting I'd spent 2 years documenting wasn't really pride at all, but was a defensiveness, a way of trying to cling to a lie, a heroic victor's history justifying the killings. And all along, and then I spent 5 years on working with Anwar and his friends exploring that to make the act of killing. Now, all this time, all throughout those 7 or 8 years, Adi would watch everything I had time to show him. And I knew from early on that I would make 2 films. One about the lies the perpetrators tell, kind of a film about escapism, storytelling, fantasy, and guilt. And I think in its superior 2-hour and 40-minute unabridged version of the film, the so-called director's cut, here in the US, but everywhere else it's just the film that came out. I feel that there it's a kind of flamboyant fever dream of a film in a far deeper way than the shorter American theatrical cut was. We made that film, but I knew I would make that film, but I also knew I would make an equally contemporary film about what does it do to human beings to have to live for 50 years in fear and in silence. I knew that would be a film made really in memoriam to all that is destroyed, not so much by the genocide itself, but by the lives that are broken through the inability to heal, the decades lost to silence, the decades lost to fear. And I knew that for that I would have to kind of create a poem about this silence, and I would have to somehow describe or depict what this silence looks like, and that of course is the look of silence.
So in the first scenes and recurring throughout the look of silence, Adi is looking at footage from the act of killing, right?
No,
He's
looking. There's no character in the act of killing who appears in the look of silence, and vice versa. He's watching reenactments, demonstrations of killing by the men who are involved with the killings at Snake River, the men who are either directly killing his brother or the commanders of those men. And all of that footage is shot between 2003 and 2005 before I met Anwar.
Okay, but so this is footage that you shot, of course.
Yeah, he's watching the earliest material that I shot with the perpetrators.
And was that difficult to ask him to look at that?
No, Adi would want to see, from the very beginning, it was Adi who first encouraged me in 2003, please film the perpetrators. And as soon as I did, he was there saying, what did you get? Let me see it. Mm-hmm. And I showed it to him, and of course it was emotional because that footage is horrifying, particularly if you're a survivor and you see that emotion all over Adi's face throughout the look of silence. That's also maybe the most, perhaps that look is eponymous in the film, the look on Adi's face. But Adi would want to see everything I had time to show him. And it was emotional for him, but I didn't ask him to watch it at all. Just as I didn't ask him to confront the perpetrators. So we shot The Look of Silence in 2012, after I finished editing The Act of Killing, but before it was released, at which point I knew I could no longer safely return to Indonesia. And when I came, I didn't know Adi would be the main character of the film yet, but I knew he would be my main collaborator. And when I returned, I said, Adi, how shall we make this second film? And he said, I've spent 7 or 8 years watching your footage with the perpetrators. I need to meet them. I think if they meet me, they will realize what they've done is wrong and they'll apologize. And in that way, and only in that way, can my family escape the prison of fear in which we're trapped, because we will be, if they can apologize, then we can forgive and we can start to live side by side, no longer afraid of each other. And I thought that was very noble and beautiful, but I also thought he would fail. I thought there's no way, having spent 7 years filming with Anwar, there was no way, or 5 years filming with Anwar, there's no way that from 2005 to 2010, there was no way that in an hour and a half, someone who's never been forced to confront their conscience would do so. Because it's too hard to live with yourself afterwards. too dangerous emotionally to do that. Let alone, never mind the fact that you risk opening the door to revenge and claims for compensation and so forth if you admit what you've done is wrong. So there's all sorts of reasons why it's hard for a perpetrator to admit what they've done is wrong unless they're forced to. But I thought he would fail in getting that apology. But I thought that if he fails in the scenes, we would succeed through the film in documenting just how torn the social fabric in Indonesia is and just how urgently a national process of truth, reconciliation, justice, and healing actually is. How urgently needed a national process of truth, reconciliation, justice, and healing is. And I also realized when he explained why he wanted to do this, that the production of the act of killing was famous across that region. If you think of the act of killing, there's a talk show in the middle of it that state television produces, regional state television produces, to hype the film while we're still making it. So all of the men Adi wanted to meet, these are the men who killed his brother in the plantation villages, they would know or believe that I was close to their highest ranking commanders, the vice president of the country, the head of the paramilitary organization, the governor of the province, the cabinet minister. They would have to think, therefore, 2 or 3 times before instructing their thugs, who are always standing by to attack us if they were instructed to do so. They would have to think 2 or 3 times before instructing their thugs to detain us or attack us, because they wouldn't want to offend their commanders. Because, of course, no one had seen the film yet. So all they thought was that we worked to make a film with their commanders. They didn't, but their commanders hadn't seen the film, and therefore wouldn't know what's in it. Of course, once the film came out, the commanders hated the film, they hated me, and only Anwar and Herman have continued to support the film and remain close to me. In any case, that very unusual situation of having shot the act of killing, been known for it, but not having released it, allowed us to do this unprecedented thing that Adi was proposing, namely to confront perpetrators while they still retain a monopoly on power. It's something unprecedented in the history of Indonesia, and that's why it's so insightful and revealing, and revealing of the tension that sort of tears apart Indonesian society. And it's also, I think, unprecedented in the history of documentary film, in that I don't think there's ever been another documentary where survivors confront perpetrators of atrocity while they retain a monopoly on power, because it's too dangerous.
How did you stage these interviews between Adi and the perpetrators? You must have had to walk into the room without the perpetrators being fully aware of his identity, right?
Yeah. First of all, they're not interviews, they're confrontations. An interview, you're interviewing me now. An interview is an attempt to get information, to get opinions. This is Adi trying to do an emotional work. He has a need to get an apology so that they can start to have reconciliation. So he needs that for his family, he needs that for himself, he needs that for all the survivors in that region. So I would come with Adi, and I would say they would know that I'd filmed them. They would know me. They know that I filmed them before. They knew that I then filmed all of their commanders and had become close to some of their commanders. I would arrive with Adi and I'd say, here's a man here's a friend of mine. He has a personal relationship to the issues we'll discuss. I want to see how, now I want to try a new method. I want to see how the two of you discuss these things. I want to document your discussion with each other. As a thank you, Adi's also an optometrist, so if you think you might have eye trouble, he'll test your eyes, and then we'll give you a free pair of glasses, if that's something that's useful for you. Now, the eye test was something I knew we could use, because first of all, it would disarm the perpetrator. They would open up while their eyes are being tested, just as we do in a barber shop. And I also knew that it was something Adi, like a haircut, could prolong for as long as necessary until the perpetrator had volunteered all of the important details to Adi that he told me years before. Because if Adi were to tell the perpetrators, look, I know what you did from Joshua's footage, the encounter would be confrontational from the beginning, and there would be no hope of getting to the dialogue that Adi wanted to get to. There would just be anger. So it was very important for the whole idea that they volunteer the details of the killings to Adi. The eye test allowed us to do it, and of course it became this very powerful metaphor. Here's these men recounting sort of Dante-esque, nightmarish details of atrocity with these scarlet lenses on while their eyes are being tested. The way they're recounting the details of killings embodies a willful blindness to the moral meaning of what they're saying, while a man is trying to help them see. So that was something I was aware would be very powerful, and also make the confrontation safer. It was always up to Adi what he would reveal about who he was or would not reveal. And as he went on through the process, he became more open. And sometimes we would have to stop in the middle because Adi would get stuck. He wouldn't know what to say, or the denial would get so thick and convoluted that we would have to figure out a way of extricating ourselves from it. I would have to speak quietly to Adi. And so as to look even-handed, I would also have to invent something to speak quietly with the perpetrator about. And so we would proceed. And we would take all sorts of other safety precautions of using a getaway car so that we could escape without being followed, shooting only with a Danish crew so that no other Indonesians would be exposed to this risk of being apprehended. Adi would come with no ID, which is a misdemeanor in Indonesia, so that we could hopefully get help from an embassy if anything went wrong before they could figure out who he was. He would come, we would have new phones, so there'd be no data. So Adi's family and our crew couldn't be tracked through our phone data. And we would have Adi's family waiting at the airport, ready to evacuate in case anything went wrong.
Yeah, I noticed in the credits that nearly everyone who worked in the film remains anonymous.
And that's true in both films.
Right. So how did it feel for you to be in that room with Adi as he's making these confrontations?
It was painful, and it was frightening. Painful because you're witnessing how broken the bonds that should be connecting people are. You see the absence of, you see where there should be community, you see fear. And you see that not only is Adi afraid of, and Adi's family, the survivors afraid of the perpetrators, you see the perpetrators are afraid of the survivors. I took a very deliberate decision of using close-ups, focusing primarily on reactions rather than the lines themselves, as a way of engendering empathy, if not sympathy, with both sides. We, of course, feel angry at the perpetrators for threatening Adi. That's inevitable, but we also feel their emotions. We don't just see them as villains. We see they're afraid, they feel trapped, they feel stuck. What do they do? And then there's one very beautiful scene, which was perhaps one of the most moving things I've ever seen, where one perpetrator, since I'd last filmed him, a man who would just hack to death busloads of people every night, had lost his hearing, or become hard of hearing since I'd filmed him 7 years before. And his daughter is now living with his daughter, and his daughter says, "Let me join the interview or the discussion so that I can make sure my father's understanding everything." And it becomes her scene. She begins by saying she felt proud of what had happened, of her father's role in exterminating the communists. But then she hears through the discussion from her father things she'd never heard about how he killed and what he did at the time of the killings. And in these grisly details, she realizes that it wasn't heroic and it was wrong. And by the end of the scene, her father's a new person to her. And she realizes at the same time he's still her father. And she has to live with that. And instead of becoming angry at Adi, or even angry at her father, she finds the dignity and the humanity and perhaps the grace to apologize on her father's behalf to Anwar, and it's to Adi. She finds the dignity to apologize to Adi, and it was one of the most, I was certainly in tears behind the camera filming that. And so there was also, these were very painful, very intense, sometimes physically frightening things to film.
You must feel that, to some degree, that maybe your work isn't finished here, and that are you going to go back there? Is there something else you want to do with Adi or for these people?
Well, I can't return to Indonesia safely, but around the two films, and I won't be making another film in Indonesia, I don't think, but around the films is a whole process, which we've spent a great deal of time and work setting in motion, where there's community screenings on a level that's far greater than any cinema release could have achieved in Indonesia. The act of killing helped catalyze a fundamental transformation in how Indonesia talks about its past, with the media and the public now talking about not just the genocide as a genocide, which they could never do before, at least not in the mainstream media and in the workplace and in schools, but also talking about the horrible present-day legacy of the genocide, which is even more dangerous to talk about: the thuggery, the corruption, the fear. So where there was once silence, there's now a lot of discussion. And then into that, because of that discussion, into that space has come the look of silence, showing how torn the social fabric is, how urgently needed truth and reconciliation are. Whereas the act of killing began its life in secret, the look of silence began its life with in a big way, sponsored by two government bodies, the National Human Rights Commission of Indonesia and the Jakarta Arts Council. The film, on its first day of release across Indonesia, had 500 simultaneous screenings, and that grew over the next couple of weeks to something like 2,500 screenings. The film was quickly called the Film of the Year across the Indonesian media. At the same time, that provoked a backlash by the army against the film, where the army started to organize thugs to attack screenings. That led to about 30 screenings out of maybe 2,500 screenings being canceled. And the National Human Rights Commission and the media reacted with outrage. So there's a kind of culture war over this film and over what should be done about this. Now that the discussion is open, what should be done? That's a long process to which, of course, I remain deeply committed, and so does Adi. Adi's in Indonesia very much a part of bringing out the film there, traveling to screenings, talking to audiences, and helping make sure that his very courageous work leaves as deep a legacy as possible.